In the last two instalments of this mini-series, we have tracked the albums Bob Dylan made that were terrifically bad and those that had their redeeming features, albeit they didn't outweigh their missteps or lazy moments. Here at the midway position, we begin to encounter records that have their peculiar charms and in fact would rank amongst the better entries in the catalogue of artists like, say, Neil Young, John Prine, or noted rock and roll buffoon Bruce Springsteen, artists occasionally considered to be Dylan's peers. These are, in short, albums with some considerable charms, a few well-intentioned duds, the kind of records that if you made one, your mother would listen to and she wouldn't sniff and tell you to get a real job. Next, a perfectly respectable album. I really can't fathom the level of opprobrium it gets from some quarters of fans. The occasionally wobbly, frequently delightful, and from time to time substantial Together Through Life from 2009. Wobbly because one song in particular, If You Ever Go to Houston, feels like a leftover from the previously underwhelming Modern Times. Forgetful Heart and This Dream of You are inoffensive throwaways, although This Dream of You is wonderfully well sung. Jolene and Shake Shake Mama, My Wife's Hometown and It's All Good are all fun and funky fun too. Of the superior songs, Life is Hard lingers in the memory because of its unique melody and Dylan's heartfelt vocal, and goes some measure towards answering the question, why at the point did Bob still bother? It's because there are songs out there like this to be written and performances like this still in him. I Feel a Change Coming On has a throwbacky vibe to it, a kind of part Nashville Skyline, part Desire vibe. Dylan is in impish voice here with one of those lyrics where you can't tell exactly where he is in time, and he turns a snappy phrase here and there. Dreams never did work out for me even when they did come true. The band is crackling too. And then we have Beyond Here Lies Nothing. Undeniably a great recording and a compelling performance, the song is, unfortunately, a total rip-off of Otis Rush's All Your Love. I don't know if Dylan has acknowledged this, but it does bug me, especially given that Otis Rush was ripped off at every turn of his career, and it's not like Dylan couldn't afford to pass on a 1/3 credit and get some money for Rush, who was still alive when the song came out, especially given he later lost all of his masters in the Universal fire. So, even with that unpleasantness behind us, Together Through Life is a thoroughly enjoyable and worthwhile album from Dylan's later selection. Time Out of Mind. Time Out of Mind has, like a lot of Dylan albums, a critical reputation which is difficult to divorce from its own myth and the prevailing narrative. Written while Dylan was snowbound on his Minnesota ranch, his commercial stocks denuded by increasingly poor-selling records, and his critical stock diluted by the perception of him being a legacy act which he developed across his never-ending tour. These songs are the first meaningful songwriting he'd done in over 5 years. Dylan brought back Oh Mercy producer Daniel Lanois to get the sound he had in his head, the sound of ancient bluesmen. Lanois wisely disregarded this and instead laboured to create a tailored sonic palette which evoked a postmodern take on those sounds and the philosophy of the blues, and divided fans but excited critics. Also with this album began the rebranding of Bob Dylan as the wise and wizened connection to the authentic past of American music, from using a 1930s style label on the album inner to giving him a Nobel Prize. Time Out of Mind is thick with ghosts. It's not so much a journey across an old abandoned America filmed with deserted roadside attractions and some mutual communion of loss and desperation, but a journey in and out of that country, a travel in time between the crepuscular mysteries of yore and the self-inflicted and disposable suffering of today. It drags up anachronism and juxtaposition, hell west and crooked, and reinvents Dylan as the man sent to suffer, the man who knows it all will end and there's no redemption in sight, the hard-boiled wanderer who hides his feelings behind scars, yet can tell the tale of how every scar came to mar his hide. He's the man on the front cover of the record, a man blurred by his own sense of mystery. But he is human, and he, as he has since Shot of Love, recognises human frailty as what guides how a man lives. The album is not without some significant flaws which prevent it rising higher in my estimation, at least. The quality of songs falls away badly at the end, and for purposes of categorising the album, Can't Wait to Make You Feel My Love and the at the time longest track he'd ever put on an album, Highlands, only Murder Most Foul bests it now, are immaterial, and Million Miles Until I Fell in Love With You are enjoyable but inconsequential. But the half-dozen song core of the album definitely warrants closer inspection. Beginning with Lovesick, we see Dylan shuffling through the streets filled with ghosts and dreams, recounting injuries done with mounting bitterness. The band is spare, the music fragmentary, the hired guns and crackerjacks Dylan roped in to play the album for perhaps the only time following their instructions to play less, Lanois filling the gaps with vapours and faces in the steam from the streets. But Dylan, despite all his grievances and vows to forget, concludes by admitting he'd give anything to be with his tormentor. And such is human frailty. Dirt Road Blues is divisive amongst fans, Lanois using a loop as a backing track seen as some kind of cheating, or at the very least inconsistent with the old ways vibe of the record as a whole. The layers of reverb on Dylan's voice are a bone of some contention, but I find it fits with the postmodernist philosophy of the work. This is not how Charlie Patton thought the blues should sound. This is how we think Charlie Patton may or may not have thought the blues could sound. Like every post-Hegelian view of art or history, it's what is known as a contingent proposition. In Dylan's voice, though, it is a miserable blues, about how a man must reduce himself to transcend. Even rainbows are harbingers of suffering. The tender country waltz of Standing in the Doorway is couched entirely by Dylan's weariness and a genuine sense of depression. A frustration that his perpetual movement, a theme of this album, is thwarted by time passing, either too quickly or too slowly. He sings, "Don't know if I saw you, if I would kiss you or kill you. It probably wouldn't matter to you anyhow," knowing she is as oblivious to her fate as he to his. Parties give him headaches, but he goes and he plays the game anyway because perhaps he knows they distract him from the ghost of old love, or perhaps even sadder that he may catch a glimpse of her. As the song goes on, he gathers resolution and rationalisation, but in the end there's nothing he can say. He's in his time out of mind because in his mind the blues are wrapped around his head. Overlong as it likely is, Cold Iron's Bound is the hard spine of the album. Again he is travelling, this time against his will, farther from her but deeper into terra incognita, surrounded by disembodied voices, being dragged to a muddy hellscape where the sky rains blood far from everything held sacred, both mundane and metaphorical. It's such a sad thing to see beauty decay, he yelps, but as sadder still is heard by his rejoinder, to feel your heart turn away. Painful, lingering love still abounds, but everything else is lost as Dylan, in some kind of shackle, is deracinated and abandoned. I think anyone with more than a passing acquaintance with Dylan's work will recognise Not Dark Yet as a major piece. Plain-spoken, economical and haunted by a desperate truth, Not Dark Yet contrasts the futility of Dylan's outward peregrinations with the inevitability of his inner destination, and like so much of his album, that is a dark place. A place where one will die, but that is not a place of their choosing to do so. From gay Paris to the bottom of the world filled with lies, bereft of humanity, his feelings vacated and deaf to even the murmur of a prayer. This is not the place of final darkness, but soon it will be. Finally, the song that best typifies time out of mind for me, the utterly splendid Trying to Get to Heaven. Dylan is a man who is not only in time out of mind, he's in time out of the world, belonging nowhere to no one and only truly owning his dreams. Dreams dreamt in the most anachronistic of places, a parlour, having been driven in a buggy back to a time when he was able to define his own certainties, away from the hollowness of the waking world. Not Dark Yet and Trying to Get to Heaven balance that age-old question, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream, and in those dreams, a man who, when young, sang "You ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose," and now as an older man sings, "Just when you think you've lost everything, you find out you could always lose a little more," and seeks quietus. The album is singular in Dylan's output because between re-recording, technological chicanery and legerdemain, lyrical rewrites and Dylan fighting with just about everyone, including one legendary drop-down, drag-out screaming match between Dylan and Lanois in a Miami car park, the album took almost 11 months to make. And then, as if on cue, Dylan took sick and almost died. Pericarditis, leaving him wondering if the dark had gotten there and if he'd finally get to meet Elvis. That seems to be a fitting way to conclude, with Dylan in life as in art, hanging in the shadow of the valley, his next album, 4 years away. The first thing you notice about Shot of Love is the warm tone of the songs, the vitriol that made Slow Train Coming so fascinating in its vituperative hide, the arrogance of Saved, they're gone. This is a very human record. It owns its frailties and it finds the strength to forgive them. The core of the record are some solid, tuneful songs: Watered Down Love, Dead Man, Property of Jesus, The Tender and Sarah Missing in the Summertime, and The Rollicking Trouble. The album opens strongly with a real barn burner in the title track, and the obvious choice for the single from the album, Heart of Mine, follows up. Heart of Mine's B-side, The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, has a lot to like. The rocking arrangement, a terrific vocal from Dylan. He's in really good form all over the album, but it just seems to me to have an awful lot of words to not say very much. Every Grain of Sand is an interesting song. William Blake wrote in The Auguries of Innocence, and I edit, "To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. We are led to believe a lie when we see not through the eye, which was born in a night to perish in a night, when the soul slept in beams of light. God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day." Every Grain of Sand is not a Christian track, which is often mistaken for or apologised as. It is very much in the experiential realm of Blake. If anything, it represents a kind of rapprochement between his loftier spiritual pursuits, which clearly did not bring him the peace he sought from them, and his previous more rustic vision. Situations such as the morals of despair, the pain of idleness, the flowers of indulgent, angry flames, violent dreams, and the feeling of hanging in the balance are hardly the position of a satisfied mind that he sang about on the opener as Saved. No, it's a rejection of organised religion, and a fairly explicit one at that, and a determination to find one's own path between it. It's both affirmation and complaint, affirmation of the mastery that him upstairs holds over Dylan's emotions and values, but equally a complaint that despite powerful extra-mundane patronage seems to fall on deaf ears, or at least ears that turn him back to the bitter dance of loneliness. It is a complaint to a personal God about the worldly nature of God, the strictures of Scripture and the orthodoxy of what passes for modern catechism. We are led to believe a lie, says Blake, and in the light of day Dylan sees the lie, and he sees that his destiny is controlled by his own humanity. Dylan says the song came to him whole born. He wrote it and made no changes thereafter. Interestingly, it's one of his few songs in the key of E-flat, and tellingly, E-flat is the key used by classical composers to frame devotion and intimate conversations with God. Shot of Love gets a bum rap because it's lumped in with the so-called gospel trilogy, whereas really, it's a more successful version of Infidels. In 1975, Dylan's commercial and critical stocks were at their highest. Coming off 2 consecutive #1 albums and the unreserved praise for Blood on the Tracks, he began to look for new methods of writing and working, the outcome of which was January 1976's Desire. Having initially attempted to work with a large band and an utterly untried producer in Don DeVito, the A&R man instrumental in bringing Dylan back to CBS from Asylum, as well as bringing in the playwright Jacques Levy to co-write 7 of the 9 songs, Levy would largely translate Dylan's ideas into a narrative form. The album finally evolved over many months to its final construction. The 2 keys to the album are the long cinematic ballads that open either side. The much-vaunted Hurricane, a largely fictionalised account of the 1966 murder in Paterson, New Jersey, and Dylan's belief that one of the men, although oddly not both, convicted Reuben Carter was framed, and the much-reviled Joey, which seems to make a folk hero out of a demented psychopath, mobster and killer called Joey Gallo, who met his fatal doom in 1972. Hurricane, which was met with ecstatic praise as a song that put Dylan back on the streets, made him an outsider again, and returned him to protest, as if it had dismissed all of that domestic nonsense that he'd been going through while he was still in a marriage, is a visceral and exciting record that made #1 in my hometown and showed the possibilities of a large band to Dylan, which he was about to exploit on Street Legal. And Dylan does sound wholly committed to it, but he remains wholly committed to a passionate lie. Dylan himself rewrote the story to tell a story more sympathetic to Carter, both as the accused and as a man, and inserting events that, according to witnesses at trial, simply didn't happen. He inflated his ability as a boxer. He was never #1 contender. He was on the slide, ranked 9th at the time, and was never higher than #3. He had a long record for a violent temper, including assaulting the woman who was organising the campaign to fund his retrial, and he rewrites Carter's arrest narrative. At Carter's retrial in November 1976, which was attended by none of his newfound celebrity supporters from a year before, he was found guilty again and sentence reimposed. This poses the question, where does the line between poetic license and propaganda get drawn, and does art have to be accurate to be meaningful, or is accuracy the provenance of history? Are the broader themes at play in Hurricane, particularly racism and the adversarial nature of justice, the primary focus of the story, effectively rendering Carter, or Joey Gallo, as mere actors in their own movies? Joey, which Lester Bang described as repellent romanticist bullshit, but Dylan defended as being just another one of his folk heroes standing up for the people songs, is frequently cited in the list of the worst Bob Dylan songs, although Mojo did rank it highly. And in my opinion, the low ranking is deserved. Again, editorialised to erase the vast majority of Gallo's misdeeds, the song is interesting as it reflects the fundamental Jewish belief in Maimonides' theory of weak providence. Maimonides was very possibly the most brilliant individual of the Middle Ages, which says, in short, that God largely let human beings get on with whatever they were doing, for better or for worse, but will enact specific acts of retribution for what he finds egregious to him. So when Dylan sings "One Day If God's in Heaven overlooking his preserve, I know the men who shot him down will get what they deserve," he's not only assuming Joey Gallo went to heaven, which is highly unlikely, but he's taking a position diametrically opposite to the view he had as a Christian, where God was ever arched to take out a preordained. 3 more things. Joey was included in favour of the, in my opinion, far superior Abandoned Love, a wonderful song that Dylan was possibly loath to include because it contradicted the conciliatory tone of Sarah. Secondly, Dylan and Levy have passed between one another responsibility for the lyrics, Levy at first claiming the idea and most of the lyrics as his, then disowning them, then Dylan in an interview around the release of Together Through Life, equally disowning them. And finally, unwanted as the lyrics may be, Dylan sings them at the absolute peak of his powers, with pathos and superb phrasing, especially the verse in which Gallo meets his finishing end. Between the two most famous songs, there's much more that is worthy. There's Sarah, Dylan's stark and unflinching plea to his wife, a woman perpetually masked in songs but here revealed in very human terms. It must be said from all reports, and leaving out Joan Baez's bitter and pinch-spirited and jealous assessment of her in her autobiography, that Sarah could be a bit of an odd bird at times, or as Bob said in Abandoned Love, "I love you, but you're strange." And the song concludes with a haunting, "Don't ever leave me, don't ever go." Almost a companion piece to Sarah is "Oh Sister," or more correctly, an obverse to Sarah. Given that it is based on metaphysical callings rather than the very physical and concrete ones of Sarah. There are more 60s-style surreal travelogues, Isis a metaphorical shaggy dog story where a neglectful husband returns to a wise, patient and faithful wife. Romance in Durango, an entertaining piece of no particular substance. Mozambique, which is even slighter, it actually started out as a rhyming game between Levy and Dylan. Black Diamond Bay is another drawn-out, keenly stretched melodrama owing as much to Joseph Conrad, with a droll punchline as disaster engulfs the main players and Dylan slinks off to get another beer rather than listen to another hard luck story. And finally we have One More Cup of Coffee, an otherwise insubstantial song brought to life by Emmylou Harris's remarkable singing. The album was a stupendous hit, Dylan's third straight number one, becoming then his biggest selling album ever, and the first record of his I ever bought, albeit on cassette. My first girlfriend Lily kept it in our divorce, but I got her 4 Top's Greatest Hits tape, so it was a fair trade. She dumped me for a guy named Timo from Finland who had a face who looked like a potato masher had been taken to it. Desire is a thought-provoking, engaging and endlessly re-listenable album. Even if controversial in places, there are songs which have substance. Dylan sounds confident and at times even cocky in his vocal, and with a better producer it could have been one of his best-sounding bands. It's a tribute to the greatness of what is to come that this ranks in the second tier of his records. Dylan was in an interesting pickle in 1973, both personally and professionally. His marriage to Sarah lay in a parlous state, and after their disastrous trip to Mexico in 1973 for Bob to work on the music for Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, they subsequently moved to a new home in Doom Point at Malibu, which caused fights so enormous between he and Sarah that he fled the house in 1974 to take art lessons in New York, and when he returned he claimed the two did not recognise each other. Professionally, Dylan was shocked by the sacking of his good friend and closest ally at CBS Records, Clive Davis. With Davis gone, he felt his contract renewals would not be as sympathetic, an important point given that he'd parted ways with his famous manager Albert Grossman in 1970, when he discovered that Grossman got 50% of Dylan's publishing and Dylan was desperate to make up the money. So Dylan was casting about for a new label in mid-1973. Asylum Records were founded in 1971 and seemed like the perfect home for Dylan, a folk rock-oriented label full of acts inspired by Dylan, an artist-friendly label. The fact of the matter was that by the time Dylan arrived, Asylum was David Geffen's personal fiefdom, where all of the attention was paid to Geffen's favourites such as Joni Mitchell, who later wrote Free Man in Paris for him, and Jackson Browne, the first artist signed to the label. But the rest of the artists, Dylan included, were left to scrap for the attention of their master. Geffen, who'd promised Dylan a number one album with his first release, then set Dylan a punishing pace to have that new album in stores to coincide with his planned 1974 tour. That left the planned release date 6 weeks after the final recording session on November 14, 1973. Dylan then threw a spanner in the works by changing the name of the album at the last minute from Ceremonies of the Horseman, thus meaning the album was finally released 2 weeks after the tour had started. Geffen kept his promise to Dylan by leaning on every major retail and rack jobber in California and New York to take the 500,000 copies in advance, which under the old chart rules got it to number one. But the album didn't sell all of those albums, not anywhere near it, and returns were massive. What dark chicanery managed to keep it at number one for as many as 4 weeks we can only guess at. Dylan was bitterly disappointed with the lack of sales. In fact, since it left number one in 1974, the album has sold barely another 100,000 copies as a catalogue item. What reportedly annoyed Dylan was that Asylum's 2 biggest sellers for the year were Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark and Carly Simon's Hot Cakes. These albums were at number 2 and number 3 while Planet Waves were at number 1, but eventually outsold it each by 500,000 copies. Dylan was back on Columbia by the end of the year. So, what of this album, this disregarded vagabond, this Napoleon in rags, this urchin, this empty-handed painter from the streets, this unbeloved stepchild? Since John Wesley Harding, there arose a large section of Dylan's cult that has bristled at the thought of Bob's songs softening to domestic chronicles and marital melodramas. To them, Bob is the relentlessly cynical angry guy in Wayfarers, dispensing cryptically elliptical observation on a world which he seemed weary of at 22. From the closing 2 songs of John Wesley Harding through Nashville Skyline, Self-Portrait and New Morning, it seems that Dylan had become the song and dance man, who sang only love songs that he painted himself to be at that famous San Francisco press conference. Imagine then the disdain with which Planet Waves was received, bereft as it was of rage against the collapsing American machine, and as humble was its focus on matters of homes and hearth. Turns out, had the me generation not been so desperate to find validation in those no longer interested in validating it, and actually listened to the record more than once, they may have learned a valuable lesson, because their disdain was largely unwarranted. Cozy and intimate on a night like this, and the slow burner Going, Going, Gone provide a cracking and crackling open. Tough Mama is an irresistible rocker. Hazel and Never Say Goodbye are straightforward love songs, even if Never Say Goodbye seems a verse short. Something There Is About You, however, has always been a great favourite of mine, not least for its tremendous vocal. That brings us to 5 standout songs. Standouts for different reasons. You Angel You ranks in my personal estimation as one of the worst things he's ever done, just dreadful busy work. Forever Young, a staunch favourite of fans and compilation producers, has power and majesty in its slower version, but the up-tempo roots rock version which follows it simply doesn't work. The 2 songs which most satisfied critics, and one assumes the long-suffering fans, were Dirge and Wedding Song. Some, most notably Patti Smith in a review for Cream magazine, see them as twin faces of the same coin. She was contemptuous, by the way, of the rest of the album. I feel in terms of the album that it would have been better if their placing in the sequence could be swapped, because they represent rise and fall, the beginning and the end of Bob and Sarah's marriage. Wedding Song, sung in a voice and acoustic arrangement seemingly dredged up from 1962, is Dylan at his most courtly and unveiled. Sarah here is not the sphinx-like goddess of sad-eyed ladies of the lowland, or even the silver angel of Tough Mama. She is very flesh and blood and present. Such is the power in Dylan's nakedness that Wedding Song seems like a prequel, a point from which all was to descend to Blood on the Tracks. Compare and contrast the opening lines of Wedding Song. I love you more than ever, more than time and more than love, with those of Dirge's I hate myself for loving you and the weakness that it showed, which make it seem like the song before Idiot Wind in the Chronicle of the Fall. I'm not entirely convinced though that Dirge is about Sarah directly, and maybe about some clandestine affair which Dylan undertook, perhaps in the aftermath of Simple Twist of Fate, which makes for a more sensible, literal reading. Planet Waves is a good, solid album without being a great one. Tough Mama and Something There Is About You in particular are crowd-pleasing greatest hits, some frustrating missteps, and 2 songs that seemingly circle each other like meth-crazed strippers in a knife fight. While you've never had the pleasure, I strongly recommend that you avoid the knife fight and use that time instead to indulge yourself and revisit Planet Waves. It's not strictly fair to call New Morning the recovery album from Self-Portrait, as much of it was complete as Self-Portrait was being assembled from whatever musical haberdashery and detritus was lying around the workshop. The true recovery album for Self-Portrait was the bootleg series issue of another Self-Portrait in, 2013? But in the minds of both the critical and popular canons, New Morning redeems Self-Portrait. Full of quiet, reflective and sometimes downright goofy songs, it has both gravity and charm. Perhaps its least necessary song is its most famous, If Not For You, which is not to say it's a bad song, it's really nice, a tidy, professional love song, so professional that it was covered by George Harrison and in hit format by big-eyed Aussie songstress Olivia Newton-John, who invested with a sincerity and a clear tone which makes it one of the most different Dylan covers, largely because she isn't in any way reverent and treats it purely as a song, stripping away any references to Dylan's idiosyncrasies. I'm not saying it in any way mars the album, it just sounds a bit misleading in terms of what's to come. What's to come are some classic Dylan deep cuts. Day of the Locust, Time Passes Slowly, New Morning. The vibe of several songs on Van Morrison's Tupelo Honey seem to come direct from this song. Sign on the Window, and in my opinion his major song in The Man in Me. There are also some quite wacky numbers. Went to See the Gypsy, about a fictional meeting between Bob and Elvis. The light-hearted Winterlude with its lovely vocal. I really like this song. The absolutely crackers but genuinely poetic If Dogs Run Free. And the jolly Three Angels. Father of Night, written for an Archibald MacLeish play, as was New Morning, holds the record for the shortest track on any official Dylan release, at 87 seconds. New Morning, despite Dylan apparently being hell on wheels to produce according to Al Cooper, is a fine album, and it set the tone for all of Dylan's music up to his divorce and street legal. It's shabby and sounds under-rehearsed, but Dylan's voice is terrific, especially on Winterlude and One More Weekend, and his piano playing is really good. Dylan's self-titled debut, perhaps more famous for its alarmingly poor sales on release, 2,500 in the USA and as many again in foreign territories, earning it and him the sobriquet of Hammond's Folly, is in fact an exciting collection of songs, performed with varying degrees of convincingness, which, with the benefit of 60 years of hindsight, serves as no less than Dylan's statement of mission, one he has pursued for long tracks of his career, to take the American folk song and its forms, traditions and language, and reinvent them into contemporary forms, traditions and language. In addition to covering revered acts like Jesse Fuller, Blind Willie Johnson, Roy Acuff, Booker White, Fred McDowell and Blind Lemon Jefferson, Dylan incorporates the work of his contemporaries Dave Von Ronk and Eric Schmidt, as well as two of his own songs, both naive little vignettes, Talking New York, full of country bumpkin wonderment, and Song for Woody, which, despite being cloying, is at least sincere and heartfelt. Some of the efforts are slight, You're No Good, which is redeemed somewhat by a rambunctious vocal, Talking New York, where he still hasn't mastered talking blues form, Pretty Peggy O. Others try hard but miss the mark. Man of Constant Sorrow tends to be divisive. In my opinion, it's one of his most important early recordings, but others, understandably, find his vocal off-putting and even more question the authenticity of a 21-year-old singing such a song of hard and weary life, but it turns out this song was to be the least of their worries in that regard. Highway 51, which probably needed another couple of takes to get all of its elements together. Baby Let Me Follow You Down, a slightly overcooked and long version of House of the Rising Sun. And others are triumphant, a maniacal take on Booker White's Fixing to Die, a white-hot take on Gospel Plow, a staggering version of Blind Willie Johnson's In My Time of Dying, a fun version of Freight Train Blues, and a version of Blind Lemon Jefferson's See That My Grave Is Kept Clean that would be hilarious if it wasn't so terrifying. But the nub of it all is that there isn't a dull moment on this audacious, cleverly chosen and not too seriously taken album. Dylan comes across as confident, swaggering and inventive as a vocalist, surprisingly nimble as a guitarist, and never less than unique as a harmonica player. It ranks highly to me amongst debut albums as a category unique to itself. Far from being Hammond's Folly, the making of this record, along with the 1938 Spirituals for Swing concert, represented one of the twin pinnacles of Hammond's remarkable career. The artist who performs the debut album is the product of a fervid imagination, as is most every iteration of Bob Dylan, but the album is the perfect medium for the character and a fun, challenging and bold way for a young fella to begin a career. Big 80 left Savannah Lord, gone off to California, can't live them Georgia laws. All he found at first was moonshine and circumstances without potable water or arable land. Masons gathering in the roadside, each of them digging ditches, each of them digging with the ace of spades, exploring the balance between hats and masks and crowns. All the pimps ride motorcycles, they cluster in the desert coming out of primary coloured sunset, each wearing a red tie or a sky blue depending on gang affiliations, killing our prophets, imprisoning our sanest heretics, getting high on self-shared victimization. But then 115 miles of Sonora Desert Highway, Big Sur aflame in molten golden sunset. Red letter days must have been something to see. A glory in their pomp, he shrugged his shoulders and made a deal, saying hell is full of fortune tellers and recidivist Democrats. Heaven is full of blank checks and statues, and the cat's got the whooping cough and the dog's got the flu. American Beauty is moral high-handedness, seduction and magic and the secret of handshakes, dupes and patsies, backbiters and syndicators, the lunatic and the fool, the feet of clay, hands like jars, pay through the nose to spite your face, harsh women bleeding by the rattling of their tongues, pawn your sword, pawn your chain. I had every woman in the Hampton Hotel, every one of them gave birth to a redhead child. loaning money for interest and collecting the dead in flesh and bone. How is this unjust? We tolerate the despicable and cast statues of the depraved. You'll spend $1 like you do a dime. The rooster chews tobacco and the hen dips snuff. Silence, cupidity, manifest destiny. John saw the number, but he never learned to read. Reprobate men in 10-cent hats, sloppy, drunk and sermonizing. No apology, no stated reparations, or kind of reprehensible double talk. If the good Lord's willing and the creeks don't rise, hit the lights and pass the ammunition. Infamy is on the counterpane. The landscape of cultural revisionism. Liberty? Ha! A conjurer's stunt? Freedom? Ha! Another word for nothing left to lose when the cat has got the whooping cough and the dog has got the flu. I got married once to a four-square girl, a Christian woman of unimpeachable reputation, who herself was married to another man, a fire-breathing, whore-beheading prophet of God. Things were good between us for a year or two. We used to meet in the gravel parking lot behind the Unitarian church. I used to run errands and fix radios for her, until one day she hitched up her skirts and showed me a nation sack. She said, "You're going to the boneyard, boy, and you ain't coming back." I cried, "Larks a mercy." I was blind in one ear and totally deaf in my nose. She threw the dice and stuffed them in my bedclothes. She said, "I love you, but my ears are full of poison. I came seeking the moon. I found only a flower garden. I fell asleep, and now I'm dead. What more is there to say? I know you're salty, you lover, fat mouth Sam, a rounder and a grinder who sold all his poultry for a bucket of beer. I see you unfold for him like a butterfly naked in your kitchen, and I ain't fazed. He's just as dead as I am. And I'm the best dressed man in the graveyard, baby. Ain't no one needs to shine my shoes." When the cat's got the whooping cough and the dog's got the flu. We yearn for a pragmatic mesmerist, a thrower of flowers, a balcony manipulator, one hand on the Bible, the other on the abortionist's hook. But what we get are mountebanks in collared cuffs, speaking in hand jive, Billy E. collars, greased manners in pompadours, kings. What we get are kid gloves when we plainly crave walking boots. So you spend all your salt, you pay your taxes, you're a modern individual, cold in the hand, deep in the policy game. Modern consciousness plus the white man's burden is the brand new staving chain. What we get is instruction to the witless, not eyesight to the blind. Judges are dissemblers who are constantly on the make. Fraud is the only insurance. Ambiguity is the currency of the afterlife. The truly righteous man will not shiver when he wears his own skin. He kills new dealers on sight and strikes his bargain on an agrarian handshake. The last righteous man comes running from Foggy Bottom to Capitol Hill, hollering, "The hurricane is coming, the hurricane is coming." Unloose the helicopter, lash down the women folks, gas up the terror plane. The world is shaking. Any man who claims rights without assuming responsibilities is a scoundrel, a fish-shaking televangelist for every shallow grave. Anyone who says live free or die should be made to do so. But this man is not the president. This man is not Undersecretary of Agriculture. This man is not the editor of a major urban newspaper. The righteous man has no voice in the major urban newspaper, on Facebook or Fox News. And yet the cat's still got the whooping cough and the dog's dead from the flu. Back when, by the end of 1978, in the days when there was mystery to rock stars, new music from your favourites was like a thunderbolt, and old music was risky and its place in history ill-documented. I'd cobble together at least 5 albums of Bob's. Street Legal, that indecipherable barrage of words and swamp of sounds. Desire, my great favourite, a virtually untouched blood on the tracks. Hard Rain, the aggressive live album that sounded like it was recorded in a garage. And Live at Budokan, which was almost certainly a gift of some kind and was and is still unspeakably awful. Imagine then my surprise at being gifted an ancient copy of Nashville Skyline, which came with the advice, "I used to love this, now I can't listen to it." My response, should I ever re-gift this album, because I still have it, would be the same sentiments in reverse. On first listening it seemed so pointless, so slight, so devoid of substance, that it demanded re-listening to try and find some kind of merit. I think it's just that, being but of tender years, I wasn't able to appreciate those merits. Over the years, though, they became brilliantly obvious. Opening with a more missed than hit duet with Johnny Cash, both men sing beautifully, especially Cash, it's hampered by the fact that the men sound like they're not only in different rooms but in different cities, so lacking in cohesion is it. This is followed by a jolly but equally pointless instrumental. By the time we get to the first song proper, further obfuscation, Dylan's raw voice asking, "Is it rollin', Bob?" Bob being producer Bob Johnson. The songs themselves are the true delights. Rendered in a deeper, smoother, what is popularly called a croon by Dylan, and backed by a red-hot band, these songs are far from the caustic, cosmic put-downs of the mid-1960s, and while they continue some of the themes of John Wesley Harding, these are songs of experience, though both lost and earned. The cookin' to be alone with you exhorts the rewards of true love. The baleful I threw it all away is this obverse, the story of a man who learned that lesson too late. The lusty and swingin' Peggy Day possibly could have been sequenced earlier, before To Be Alone With You, perhaps, is most remarkable for Dylan's nuanced vocals, displaying a sense of swing which hasn't ever really been tapped into again until the Sinatra trilogy. The hit single Lay Lady Lay opens up on side 2. Dylan sounds a little shaky in his lower baritone. Also, whatever colours you have in your mind, I'll show them to you and you'll see them shine, ranks with the worst rubbish he's ever written. One More Night is my favourite song on the album. It's Dylan's best vocal here, one of his best ever. He croons, he sings, he bends his notes like Jimmy Witherspoon, and the band is in fine fettle behind it. It has a cousin song, I Threw It All Away, but it is superior in every aspect. If there's a disappointment on the album, it's Tell Me That It Isn't True, where Dylan seems to be treading water in a genre exercise. It's not by any means substandard, just a little joyless and disappointing compared to the great songs around it. Country Pie is 99 seconds of hot picking and silliness, probably written to entertain Dylan's ever-abounding multitude of children. We wouldn't hear something this farcical until Wiggle Wiggle in 1991, or perhaps Man Gave Names to All the Animals, but here at least we're laughing with Bob and not at him. The album concludes a song or two too soon perhaps, with Tonight I'll Be Staying Here With You. It's a pleasant but not a great song. Dylan's vocal is more than adequate but not up to par with his best on the album, and Bob Wilson's piano on this, however, is a treasure. No summary of the record would be complete without the story of the remarkable album cover. Originally, Dylan wanted to call the album John Wesley Harding No. 2, and a photograph was taken by Elliot Landy at Woodstock outside a local bakery of Dylan, a couple of yokels, and his son Jesse. A week or so later, Dylan pulls the shot. He doesn't want Jesse in the picture. Meanwhile, Al Clayton takes a random shot of Nashville's skyline, which Dylan loves, and also gives him an album title. Then Johnny Cash messes everything up by submitting a poem that Dylan also loves. The decision is made to move Clayton's pick and Cash's poem to the rear and remount the front cover. So up Landy troops to Birdcliff, which was Dylan's home, and a new shot is commissioned. Bob is wearing the same jacket he wore on the cover of Freewheelin', Bob Dylan, Blonde on Blonde, and John Wesley Harding, toting a Gibson Hummingbird gifted to him by George Harrison, and goofing around with a funky old hat. The shot was a 1 in a million, which Dylan immediately identified as the one he wanted. Landy was heartbroken though when Columbia put their logo up on the front corner, which totally destroyed the sense of perspective of the shot. So that's a story at least part told, but it leaves the question unanswered. Is this country music? Of course, many would reply. Shut up, you idiot, would reply many others. I'd be more qualified. It's more like a reasonable facsimile of country music. It's like music from cowboy films, devoid of country music's primitivism. It's technically spectacular, but in places lacks passion, and Dylan's vocals are amongst the very best he ever cut, but seemingly owe little to country music. Dylan's vocals had always been a vehicle for the persona he wants to lay down, but here there's very little country in them. He sounds more influenced by the likes of Al Hibbler or even Gatemouth Brown. Not a bad thing, just an odd thing. You can't even describe Nashville skyline as countrypolitan, lacking as it does the grosser excesses of that music. But in the long run, that's an arch debate. The unassailable fact of the matter is this is a near great album, plain spoken and wonderfully sung, full of songs that explore life's big experiences in intimate ways, and it's an essential addition to any collection of Bob Dylan's work.